You know, I think on the issue of Brexit, it seems one of the conditions that I think we have to consider, which was mentioned or is evident in the presentations, is that British universities that were really good at leveraging resources and things related to the EU and being international generally. I mean, certain advantages by having the English language and these kinds of things, but they've really gained a lot by being, in this particular case, not all of British society, but tremendous advantage. Now we're kind of coming up to a very vague area where period where we don't know what's really going to happen. So I want to ask you, what do you think is the worst scenario that we could see for British universities? I mean, of course, we hope that won't happen, but what's the worst scenario? Why don't we start with Brendan, and then we'll ask the others.
Well, I don't like too much to dwell on that, because actually it's quite interesting to look at what the opportunities are, which we haven't got onto yet. But
well, we can come back to that. First, tell us the worst.
If we are looking at the worst, obviously the worst would be you lose your position as coordinators in Horizon 2020. You're out of Horizon 2020 altogether. You're struggling to make free trade agreements with the EU to do other things like have branch campuses. You're struggling to, you know, it'll take a long time to replace what you're already doing in Europe with other people, but that can be done. You know, I think it's the temporary situation that's the worst, because they have the quality and the experience of leveraging, as we said, and the relationships with lots of other parts of the world. They don't rely only on the EU. It's just that it would be a significant dent, but it doesn't mean it would finish off UK universities. They're quite capable of partnering with other people. They already do. So, but one of the myths of the Brexit campaign is that, oh, well, if we leave the EU, we just do all these trade agreements with other countries. But one factor that doesn't take into account is that the EU is on your doorstep and the other countries aren't. And that obviously creates a whole set of additional barriers and costs if you want to then partner with other people. But you can do it.
Well, okay, so let me just, one example here. The initial Brexit was voted, and Theresa May said, or her administration said, HEFKE or whatever, what is left of HEFKE, I can't figure this out, but is that, you know, don't worry, we'll replace the funding that's lost from the European Research Union for the European Research Area, because they want to create stability, right? Because universities need stability generally to do what they do best. And so there was this initial promise, don't worry, you know, we'll also try to figure out how EU citizens, talented EU citizens might stay. And then things have become much more gray. That initial position is kind of eroded, and it's not clear at all. So there's a lot of, I think this aspect of instability is really significant. And you know, maybe it's a short-term thing, but this gets back to, at least Rahul, at least you're talking about, where, you know, are people going to come? I'll give you the example I would say and ask you is about Ireland. So Ireland has been in a significant source for students, talent, and mobility. You know, what can England do if they're no longer, you know, Irish citizens are part of the EU and not? So, what do you think of that area?
No, I think it's a good question in the sense that it really makes us prepare for the worst and still get the better outcomes. So the time frame is very important, and I agree with Brendan on that one aspect, and that is that the underlying strength and the reputation of British higher education is really solid. There are those relationships which have been built around the world that still people, prospective students, have a pull to go to the UK to study for further education. So from the student mobility perspective, within EU and outside EU is very strong. The short to medium term uncertainty is very high for a student to make a confident decision. And that's where the biggest risk is. The short to medium term, the student can go anywhere. Ireland could be a good option. They may start considering China as an option, that, oh, there are these world-class universities emerging here. The options are becoming much wider for the student to choose from, and we see it in our data also, that students are now considering other alternatives also. We look into our surveys and we find that clearly they say, if these policies get enacted, what will be the implication? We clearly see an indicator, students saying, I'm not going to UK. So the short to medium term is going to be severe. So the worst case scenario is a shrunken British higher education system. There could be potential mergers, there could be potential closures, there could be a lot more have and have-nots kind of situations.
A lot of brain drain.
You got it.
From the in terms of faculty and researchers, not just students.
Exactly, loss of talent, so loss of reputation, rankings, and so on. But the bigger aspect which could be troubling is a lot of institutions which are mid-tier and highly dependent on the tuition from non-EU students. They are going to suffer the most, and the only consequence they'll have, mergers or closures, because the revival will be so difficult for them to fill from the domestic population. So to put that pessimistic.
I can't remember if this is still true, but and maybe you said this, but something like 25% of all the income that comes to British higher ed comes from international students and what they charge them. I know, again, there's confusion because if you're an EU student, you're supposed to be only charged the rate that has been changing in the British side. I want to make sure we get Sheldon in here. So one thing I wanted to help to at least note that relates to the theme that you had is, and I struggled a little bit about this, the title, because New Nationalism is a title that was used by Theodore Roosevelt as part of his campaign in the earlier part of the century, and it was a very liberal campaign. It was a campaign to limit the growth of trusts and corporations. It was to provide greater liberties for women, concept of the civil service program, all of this packaging of the progressive era. But absolutely, I think your point is well made. Nationalism isn't always a bad thing. But in some form, do you think maybe Britain shouldn't have entered the EU in that period? Was there reasons that it shouldn't have done that? And do you have any thoughts on
Can I answer the first question?
Yeah, okay, yes, go ahead.
The first question was, what's the worst thing that can happen?
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry.
You've all said it.
Okay, yeah, that's
the worst thing is
okay.
to do nothing. Is to do nothing. But no, John, I'm not going to answer that one.
Okay.
Too objective in his story.
It is being recorded, so.
Now, what I want to say is, I want to. My natural response to events is to be pessimistic and gloomy, all right?
Yeah.
So it would be out of character for me to express any kind of optimism whatsoever. So I hesitate to do that. On the other hand, let me go back over my own lifetime and to see what has happened. There have been more. The British higher education system, as it emerged after the Second World War, was so utterly transformed in the next 40 years that you could hardly believe that it had ever been in any other form. Right? The whole new universities of the 1960s, my gosh, a tremendous expansion, with cries that more means worse. I don't know if you've run across that expression, but the more we open up the universities to more students, the worse they will become. That was the cry of the 1960s. And then we don't have any money, and all the American universities are rich, and the brain drain was talked about. In the meantime, the system is expanding, it's diversifying, and it's creating real global eminence. And when I look at what Cambridge University has done today, it's created a whole second Cambridge. There's a new train station, there's a whole new city, there are startups all around it. It's extraordinary what's been done. Now, a lot of that has transpired without the assistance from the EU. It began without the assistance from the EU. Once the gloomy posture was overcome. I think that, look, when you look at the long run history, you know this, John, you're a historian, you look at the long run history of universities, ups and downs. Look at the history of Berkeley, right? The history of the University of California. We have had downs, but we have also had great ups. It's going to be that way. The university is so terribly implicated in all the activities in the society that whatever happens out there is going to have not a reflection, I don't believe that, but it's going to have some kind of response from inside. There's an enormous amount of talent that lies within the higher education system. To do nothing would be foolish. And I honestly don't believe that the British academic communities will do nothing. They have really been innovative now. So they'll take a hit in the short run, but you made the point, Rahul. They very strong systems, and Oxford and Cambridge have really emerged in some of the some of these global rankings at the very top now, even topping the American universities. All right, that depends on these rankings and what criteria you're ranking. We all know those problems, and it's overdone. Because when you take the top, 10, 20, 30, 40 universities in the world, they're really quite interchangeable in many.
Okay, this is enough optimism. Okay. I want to come back. Are we going to, I think, and Brandon asked you, is this question that there are some institutions are not going to survive potentially through this, so there's going to be a restructuring of some sort. Maybe, going down that road, it'll be a smarter, more mean system. I don't know. What do you think, Brandon? What do you think this is?
Well, I don't know if it'll lead to that or not, because we don't actually know what type of Brexit we're going to have yet.
Yeah,
but what we do know is that a very significant portion of funding does come from international students, and of that, some of it comes from EU students. And actually, one of the things they'll be able to do after Brexit is to charge EU students
money,
the rate they pay, they charge a higher rate that they charge to other international students.
Has there been good modeling on that? My understanding there hasn't, but...
Well, basically they'll be able to pay more to come to a country that welcomes them less.
Yeah.
So let's see how that works out.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask another question. I hope you're thinking about questions, because we'll go to you in just a second. And this relates a little bit to our tomorrow morning's session, about which we'll have another keynote by Wilhelm Krul, and then we'll have Marek van de Vende and Christine Muselin to talk about what's happening in Europe. And so one of my questions is, well, who gains from this? Is there a positive effect or a negative effect? I still don't really understand this in terms of, and again, I realize we don't know what the terms are of Brexit, so that, but but will Europe, in some form, continental Europe, somehow see some gain in this? Do you think that is, or what's your opinion on this?
No, John, there are so many trends that are going on that have nothing to do with Brexit, which are disturbing, and they've been mentioned today. There's rightward movements in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. That really doesn't have anything to do with Brexit or in France. So it may be hard to isolate the Brexit phenomenon from some of the other disturbances that are going on. There's obviously, and Brexit itself may in fact be a response to what some people are referring to. The world is being transformed. It's being transformed through one of the most extraordinary technological revolutions we've ever known. And an awful lot of people can't flourish in that environment. So, yes, we could talk about whether Brexit is going to, in some sense, do some damage to Europe, but let's bear in mind the other trends that have been there that really may be independent from Brexit.
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to kind of is the follow the money question. What happens if you're not? So if you saw the charts that both of you basically showed that British universities do very well under the Horizon 220 program. It's a net income source. So suddenly, obviously, the British I guess they're negotiating Brexit, whether it's $80 billion. That doesn't seem like that much money versus 20 or something. Not in the American context, at least. But there's going to be a shift here internally in the EU on the research side. Do you see anything about this? Is this going to be a new opportunity for the European higher ed area to redefine itself? Or
can I just say that some of them are seeing this as an opportunity. They want to become the coordinators of the projects. There's a growing trend of English language programs taught in the English language in European universities.
That will be competitive with what the British market
is.
Yes, but that's been going on, hasn't it?
It has been going on already, but it could
it
could pick up speed. And countries like Ireland are wanting to take over various other centres of scientific organisations that are for the EU that need to move out of the UK. It's countries like Ireland will want to take them. So there's, other countries will see it as an opportunity as well as a loss.
Right.
So, thanks.
And next we're going to questions. So think of a question and we'll have the mics. Okay.
I wanted to address your question that, is this an opportunistic opportunity for continental Europe? And a plug here with Engel from EAIE is also here, and with StudyPortals we were able to work on a project specifically on the rise of English taught bachelor's program. And we clearly saw, based on the StudyPortals data, so of course it's a subset of whatever is happening in the market. But just taking that subset, we have seen a dramatic increase in the number of English taught bachelor's programs. Now, we cannot attribute it to Brexit, but what I'm saying is that now, given the supply of these English taught bachelor's program, and on the other side, there is a pricing pressure because now EU students may have to pay a different fee now to go to the UK. Will they start considering these English taught bachelor's program in other destinations? Because there is a huge differential in the pricing of a EU versus non-EU student. And an EU student is not at a place at this point to absorb that new price differential. So in the immediate to short term, to your point, continental Europe can gain a lot in terms of student mobility to attract in their English programs, which they have been building for the last 10 years. But somehow this crisis has given some opportunity to the institutions to become more attractive.
All right, so we should go to the floor. Who has a question? Yes, Wilhelm. And please just say who you are again for the
Yeah,
posterity.
my name's Wilhelm Kroll from Germany, and we'll talk about Europe tomorrow. And apparently the UK is already no longer part of Europe. I listen to you. But let me just ask a question which may relate to what happens to the United Kingdom as a system and what happens to individual institutions. And you touched upon it, that there will be very differentiated approaches and maybe even mergers and whatever. But when I look at the other side of things, you see, I'm coming across from Portugal all the way via Paris to Germany, major institutions from the United Kingdom already negotiating not just, let's say, branch offices, because that's, as Brendan was pointing out, a difficult issue to achieve, depending on the overall results. But more and more, they move in the direction of joint ventures. British people are usually very pragmatic when it comes to money, so they are looking for these kind of opportunities, particularly with respect to the next framework program, because otherwise, particularly if the issue of mobility will not be acknowledged, and Brandon, you pointed to it, that mobility, free flow of goods, people, services, and capital is essential. And the Swiss were already excluded for quite some time, as you also mentioned. So the critical thing is, what will, in the end, be the British government's attitude to these kind of things, and how can then the institutions respond to it? And is joint venture a solution to it, or what do you think about it?
Who is to answer? Who is to answer?
Anybody, just go ahead.
Anybody? But I think really this is really the central question, Bill, because what Brexit has shown us, if we needed that, Brexit has the potency of an event that occurs in a short time so we can see it explode, is that it has shown us the weaknesses in political systems, the breakdown of almost every level. Look at the breakdown of the political parties in Britain, so that the ill-advised decision on the part of Theresa May to call another vote led to her having an alliance with a somewhat suspect Irish party in order to maintain some majority there. The political parties are fighting. The Tories are certainly fighting, or they're not Tories anymore. The Conservatives are certainly fighting over what to do with the thousands of pieces of legislation that need to be implemented with respect to this. They all have different ideas. Right? The Labour Party has an anti-Semitic component that's come out. That is really, your question really seems to me to strike at the heart of the whole issue, and that is to remember that power really lies with governments. Political power is where the authority is, the taxing authority and every other kind of authority. There are no free societies unless there are free societies. If there are confused governments, there are going to be confused universities. Okay? So I mean, I would worry about that more than just about anything else.
And I think the key question for the UK government is funding, and that they're already facing, as part of the general trend of all these different political trends I was talking about, one of them is backlash against tuition fees. And there's a growing sense that now that people no longer accept that tuition fees are inevitable and have to be paid, and the Labour Party is advocating abolishing them, and there are increasing reports that they're no longer delivering on addressing iniquity when they're balanced with the measures that they should be balanced with, of scholarships and maintenance grants, which have been abolished by this government. That's no longer enough. And so already questions are being raised about university funding and whether they really need to rethink the whole reform. And this will really add to that, because you will put in jeopardy funding from EU students, although it's more modest than per student. And the university's reliance on funding from international students, either they'll have to get more international students from elsewhere, or the government will have to address that in some way. And it will have to address the lack of support if it comes out of Erasmus+. It will have to address that. But in terms of individual institutions, I attended a UUK, that's the Vice-Chancellor's body, conference only recently, a couple of weeks ago, on TNE, transnational education and the export of education. And those universities, I mean, even the university that calls itself the most European university, Kent University, was positive about forging new partnerships. There is that sense that some universities like Nottingham have led this idea of joint degrees as a new model, where you get students to do part of their degree in the UK and the rest in their home country, but through support from the UK university.
I think those are always interesting things, but they're kind of at the margin. They're not scalable generally, but unless there's some new, totally online version that comes into being. But Suzanne, you had a question?
Yes, I have a question too.
Please use the microphone, please, and say who you are.
I'm Susanna Lohman from UCLA, and I have a question for Rahul. So you said something that got me thinking. You said survival will be hard for some of these places in Britain with just domestic students. And that suggests, normally we think of student mobility and study abroad and internationalization are just great things, and people become more cosmopolitan, etc. But the thing might be a little bit more ethically muddled, okay? And so it seems that in the rich countries, meaning United Kingdom, in the United States and so forth, universities are often taking on international students simply because we want the money, right? And so, and it could be problematic because we're getting international students from developing countries where people overall are very poor, and then the rich people in those countries, let's say if UCLA takes a Chinese student, that Chinese student comes from a country where the mean income is about $10,000, and that Chinese students then forks over something like $50,000 to UCLA, right? So the redistribution seems to be going in the wrong way, right? Or if you take of branch campuses, so New York University, etc., in the Middle East, we're not really going there to modernize, right? So those countries are sort of modern in a flashy way, that they have skyscrapers and stuff like that. But deep down, they are totally pre-modern, right? So, well, what I want to say is that there seems to be something sort of vaguely unethical about the whole thing.
Sure. So to your point, Suzanne, that is something unethical about internationalization, and especially international student part of the equation. I don't think so. It's unethical at all. So there is on one side, there is a value proposition which universities are offering. And it's a sum total of many things: experience, life, brand, diversity, culture. There are so many variables to it, and it's very difficult to parse out that what one variable is costing to the student. So there is a value proposition which a university is offering, and there is someone who is willing to be part of that, offering to be learning from that. So it's a very well-known and understood phenomena. However, there is nothing unethical about it. There are two elements which are very important to recognize there, and something to your question also, that the joint ventures as a way of survival. Recruitments are taking that tone in recent years in the post-recession environment, that it's becoming a mode of survival to some institution. Now that's borderline over-reliance and over-dependence on a segment of students for funding the university. That could be problematic, yes, but prior to that, when there is a great experience being offered to that international student and the domestic student, because now that international learning is happening at home. The many students, American students or British students, are not even able to get a chance to go abroad. We still are talking about study abroad and mobility as an elite phenomena of 2% of the higher education moving around. There are only 5 million students who are studying outside their home country for a higher education system of 300 million students in post-secondary education. So it is still an elite phenomena. The only way you can expand the access is leveraging those 5 million students who are going out to create opportunities for the rest of the population. So internationalization is a win-win for everyone, but there are limits to every phenomena. And I accept your point that institutions which are going to other extreme of making it only the purpose of their existence could be problematic.
Last question, and Salim, please, I hope it's a short one.
So I don't want to get into whether it's ethical or unethical, but there's a different way of looking at it. You know, these questions are acutely tinged, whether you're looking from the south-north, whether you're looking from the north-south. I speak from the south, because I'm South African and I'm African citizen. So it's not about ethical or unethical, but you know, sometimes I worry, as someone who's a champion, who's passionate about university and higher education, about our own blind spots. And you know, we imagine and we cast out ourselves as universities as incredible bulwarks of cosmopolitanism and internationalism and so on. Right? So when we speak about opportunities are perhaps less about financial issues. The opportunities of putting something right in the UK itself. Because the last time I looked at the UK, its top universities are perhaps the most undiverse universities in the world. All right? Those top two. Yeah. And there are trade-offs being made. I mean, our colleague from Alaska was absolutely brilliant on that. About the dilemmas that you're setting out and the trade-offs you're making all the time. So perhaps it's not unconnected to the fact of how eager those universities are to bring in international students. Because with that international student comes 2-3 times the fees of local students and so on. So, you know, I think we have to start being a little more critical about how we don't cause populism or nationalism, but how we are part of that whole equation sometimes. Because many of those who we would like to call populists or the unwashed, as Hillary kind of call them, are the people who are not benefiting from those universities in the UK or in South Africa or elsewhere. So I think there's some critical reflection required at this moment.
Okay, I think we need to end this session, so we have a break and have the final session of the day. I only want to say that it does feel like there's so much uncertainty going into the stretch here, because technically Brexit is supposed to be solved, or that whatever deal is made, in about a year and 3 months or so. So the timeline is really short. So this gives you a sense of, it really, nobody knows quite what the heck's going to happen in this process. And again, stability, instability, these are big factors for universities. So, okay, so we're going to take a break and we're going to reconvene at 3:45. 3:46, please come back for the final session. There's coffee out there.
This was excellent.
Thank you. And thank you to the panel. Sorry.
You know what we